scene opens with tactical officers bursting through a cabin door, weapons drawn, shouting commands at a terrified family inside. The camera freezes on the chaos. What you're about to witness is the shocking true story of how a simple property dispute escalated into armed intimidation, identity theft, and a web of corruption that would expose one of the most ruthless HOA schemes ever documented in court. The morning mist still clung to Lake Serenity when David Chen stepped onto the wraparound porch of his family's cabin, coffee in hand, completely unaware that his peaceful retreat was about to become a battlefield. For 3 generations, the Chen family had owned this modest but beloved lakeside property in the mountains of North Carolina. What had once been pristine wilderness was now dotted with luxury developments, and the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had been eyeing David's non-conforming cabin. With increasing hostility, David, a 45-year-old software engineer from Charlotte, had inherited the cabin from his grandfather 2 years earlier. The property predated the HOA by decades, making it legally exempt from their jurisdiction. But that technicality hadn't stopped HOA President Margaret Blackwood and her board from launching an increasingly aggressive campaign to force him out. It started small. Violation notices for his unapproved dock, despite having permits dating back to 1987. Complaints about his gravel driveway not meeting community standards. Letters demanding he remove his grandfather's handcrafted mailbox because it violated aesthetic guidelines that didn't legally apply to his property. David had tried reasoning with them. He'd attended board meetings, brought legal documentation, proving his exemption status, even offered compromises. But Margaret Blackwood, a former corporate lawyer with stale gray hair and eyes to match, had made it clear that his rustic cabin was an eyesore that threatened property values. In their exclusive community, Mr. Chen, she had said during their last face-to-face encounter, her voice dripping with condescension, "You need to understand that times change. Your little shack might have been charming in your grandfather's day, but this is a modern community with standards." The harassment escalated. Anonymous complaints to the county about supposed septic violations that required expensive inspections. Reports to environmental agencies about unauthorized construction that triggered lengthy investigations. Each time, David was cleared, but the stress and legal fees were mounting. Then came the morning that changed everything. David's wife, Sarah, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had joined him for a long weekend at the cabin. They were having breakfast on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. When the sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning silence, "Daddy, who are those people?" Emma asked, pointing toward the tree line. David's blood ran cold. 6 black SUVs were racing up his private driveway, kicking up clouds of dust. As they screeched to a halt surrounding his cabin, armed tactical officers poured out, their faces hidden behind black masks and helmets. "Get on the ground now." The officers stormed the porch, automatic weapons trained on David and his terrified family. Sarah screamed, instinctively shielding Emma, who began crying hysterically. "Hands where we can see them." David's mind raced as he slowly raised his hands. "There's been a mistake," he said, trying to keep his voice steady for his daughter's sake. "I'm David Chen. This is my property." The lead officer, his badge reading Sheriff's Department, stepped forward. "We have reports of armed trespassers and illegal firearms on this property. We're executing a search warrant." "That's impossible," David protested. "I don't own any guns. And we're not trespassers, sir. Step back. We have authorization to search these premises for evidence of criminal activity." For the next 2 hours, the armed officers ransacked David's cabin while his family huddled together on the porch, traumatized and confused. They tore through closets, overturned furniture, and dismantled his grandfather's carefully preserved workshop. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. As the officers prepared to leave, David approached the team leader. "I want to see that warrant," he demanded. The officer handed him a document, but something was wrong. The letterhead looked official, but the language was oddly phrased. David studied it more carefully, his software engineer's attention to detail kicking in. "This isn't a real warrant," he said, his voice rising. "The case number format is wrong. The judge's signature doesn't match public records." The officer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Sir, I'd advise you not to interfere with official business." But David had already noticed something else that made his blood boil. In the corner of the forged document, barely visible, was a watermark he recognized from countless HOA CORRESPONDENCES. The fake tactical team packed up and drove away, leaving his family shattered and his home destroyed. David Chen realized he wasn't dealing with an overzealous HOA anymore. He was dealing with criminals. And they had just made their biggest mistake. The days following the raid were a blur of sleepless nights and desperate phone calls. Emma refused to return to the cabin, having nightmares about bad men with guns every night. Sarah, normally the rock of their family, jumped at every unexpected sound. David watched his family crumble while rage and determination burned in his chest. He started with the obvious call to the sheriff's department, but the response only deepened the mystery. "Mr. Chen," Sheriff Tom Morrison said over the phone, his voice genuinely puzzled. "We have no record of any operation at your property, no warrants issued, no tactical deployment authorized. Someone impersonated my officers." David felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean those weren't real police?" "No, sir, they were not. And I can tell you right now, that's a federal crime. We're opening an investigation immediately." But David couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Using his technical skills, he began researching the document he'd been shown. The watermark was indeed from Blackwood's law firm. But deeper digging revealed something more disturbing. The tactical team vehicles had been caught on traffic cameras throughout the county. That morning, David obtained the footage through a Freedom of Information Act request and spent hours analyzing the license plates. They traced back to a private security company called Guardian Elite Solutions. Guardian Elite's website was professional but vague, advertising executive protection and property security services. But when David cross-referenced the company's incorporation documents, he discovered something that made his hands shake. Margaret Blackwood was listed as the primary investor. The whole president hadn't just orchestrated harassment she had funded, a private army to terrorize his family. David's lawyer, Patricia Morse, was a seasoned civil rights attorney who specialized in property disputes. When David showed her the evidence, her normally composed demeanor cracked. "David, this is unprecedented," she said, spreading the documents across her conference table. "We're not just talking about HOA overreach anymore. This is conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, and potentially domestic terrorism. What do we do?" David asked. Patricia's eyes hardened. "We take them down, all of them." Their investigation revealed a pattern of escalating intimidation tactics that went far beyond David's case. Through social media posts and court records, they discovered that Guardian Elite had conducted similar raids on at least 6 other properties around the lake hall, targeting homeowners who had clashed with the Willowbrook HOA. The most heartbreaking case was elderly widow Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, whose grandson posted a viral TikTok video showing her being handcuffed in her own garden by fake officers claiming she was growing illegal substances. The marijuana plants turned out to be tomatoes. David realized he wasn't Margaret Blackwood's only victim, he was just the first to fight back. Working with Patricia, David began building a case that would expose the entire conspiracy. They filed complaints with the FBI, the State Attorney General, and the Department of Justice. But they also launched their own covert investigation. David installed a sophisticated surveillance system around his cabin, complete with hidden cameras and audio recording devices. If Blackwood's people returned, he'd be ready. He didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks after the initial raid, David's motion sensors triggered in the middle of the night. On his phone, he watched as the figures in dark clothing crept around his property, clearly searching for something. One was planting what looked like packages near his shed, while the other was taking photographs. David's blood ran cold as he realized what he was witnessing. They were planting evidence, probably drugs or weapons, to justify their earlier raid and provide grounds for criminal charges against him. But this time, every second was being recorded in high definition. The next morning, David reviewed the footage with growing excitement and horror. The audio was crystal clear, and the two figures had removed their masks during what they thought was a covert operation. One was Jake Morrison, Margaret Blackwood's nephew and a Guardian Elite employee. The other was someone David recognized from HOA meetings board member Thomas Crane, a retired police detective who had been vocal about cleaning up the lake community. "Make sure those baggies are hidden good," Crane's voice came through clearly on the recording. "When we come back with the warrant next week, we need to find enough to put Chen away for 10 years. "What about the little girl?" Jake asked, his voice betraying some hesitation. "What about her? Kid'll be better off without a drug-dealing father." David's hands clenched into fists as he watched them plant what looked like bags of cocaine around his property, but his anger was tempered by a grim satisfaction. They had just confessed to framing him on camera. As Patricia reviewed the surveillance footage, her expression grew increasingly severe. "David, this recording is absolutely damning. We've got them dead to rights on conspiracy, planting evidence, and criminal impersonation, so we can stop them." Patricia smiled for the first time since taking his case. "Oh, we're going to do much more than stop them. We're going to destroy them." But neither David nor Patricia realized that Margaret Blackwood had been watching them just as carefully as they'd been watching her. And the whole president had one more devastating card to play. The federal courthouse in Asheville was packed beyond capacity as United States v. Blackwood began. What had started as a property dispute had mushroomed into a RICO conspiracy case involving fraud, impersonation of federal officers, drug planting, and civil rights violations. Margaret Blackwood, Thomas Crane, Jake Morrison, and 6 other defendants sat at the defense table, their expensive legal team projecting confidence they clearly didn't feel. David Chen sat in the gallery with Sarah and Emma, his daughter, now old enough to understand that the bad people who had scared her were finally going to face justice. The past 8 months had been a roller coaster of FBI raids, grand jury testimony, and media attention that had turned their quiet property dispute into a national news story. Prosecutor Amanda Stevens opened with devastating precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you will hear over the next few days is not just about a homeowners association gone rogue. This is about a criminal conspiracy that used fear, violence, and the impersonation of law enforcement to terrorize innocent families and steal their property." She gestured toward a large screen that displayed photos of the fake tactical raid. The defendants didn't just harass Mr. Chen, they created a private army, complete with fraudulent warrants and fake badges, to force him and others off their legally owned property. And when that didn't work, they resorted to planting drugs to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. Defense attorney Richard Hawthorne stood to deliver Margaret Blackwood's opening statement, and David was surprised by his aggressive tone. "My client is not a criminal mastermind," Hawthorne declared. "She's a dedicated community leader who may have made some poor judgment calls, but who never authorized the extreme actions taken by rogue elements within the security company." David felt a chill. Blackwood was going to throw her co-conspirators under the bus. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. FBI agent Sarah Kim testified about the investigation that had uncovered a network of fraudulent activities spanning 3 counties. Financial records showed that Blackwood had personally approved payments totaling over $100, zero to Guardian Elite for property enforcement actions. When David took the stand, the courtroom was silent as he described the terror his family had experienced. "My 8-year-old daughter still sleeps with the lights on," he testified, his voice breaking slightly. "She asks me every night if the bad men are coming back." But the prosecution's most devastating evidence came when they played the surveillance footage David had captured. The courtroom gasped as Jake Morrison's voice filled the room. "Make sure those baggies are hidden." "Good. We need to find enough to put Chen away for 10 years. Jake Morrison's face went white at the defense table. Thomas Crane began whispering urgently to his lawyer. Defense attorney Hawthorne stood for cross-examination, and David braced himself. But instead of attacking David's credibility, Hawthorne took an unexpected approach. "Mr. Chen, you've been portrayed as an innocent victim. But isn't it true that you installed extensive surveillance equipment, specifically to entrap my client?" Patricia Moore shot to her feet. "Objection. Installing security cameras on one's own property is perfectly legal." Sustained. Judge Martinez ruled, but David could see where this was heading. Hawthorne continued, "Mr. Chen, did you not deliberately provoke this escalation by refusing reasonable compromises with the whole?" "I never provoked anything," David replied firmly. "I simply exercised my legal rights as a property owner." "And you recorded private conversations without the knowledge of the participants." "I recorded criminals trespassing on my property and planting evidence," David shot back. The defense was trying to paint David as an overzealous homeowner who had entrapped innocent community leaders, but the strategy was falling flat against the mountain of evidence. Then Margaret Blackwood took the stand in her own defense, and the courtroom dynamics shifted dramatically. Composed and articulate, Blackwood presented herself as a dedicated community leader who had been manipulated by corrupt employees. "I trusted Thomas Crane because of his law enforcement background," she testified. "When he told me that David Chen was potentially dangerous and that we needed professional security assessment, I believed him." "Did you authorize the raid on Mr. Chen's property?" her lawyer asked. "Absolutely not. I was told it was a routine property inspection." "What about the payments to Guardian Elite?" "I approved security consultant fees. I had no idea they were conducting paramilitary operations." David watched in growing alarm as Blackwood delivered a masterful performance, deflecting responsibility while appearing credible and sympathetic. But Prosecutor Stevens was ready for her cross-examination. "Ms. Blackwood, you testified that you were unaware of the specific actions taken against Mr. Chen. Is that correct?" "Yes." Stevens activated a large screen displaying a series of text messages. "Do you recognize these communications?" Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. I'd have to review them. These are text messages from your phone to Thomas Crane, recovered by FBI forensic analysts. Let me read message to 147. The Chen problem needs to be resolved permanently. Use whatever means necessary. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Blackwood gripped the witness stand. That was taken out of context. And message to 151. If legal pressure won't work, we need to explore other options. I don't care what it costs. I was referring to additional legal strategies. And message to 189. Sent 3 days before the raid. Jake says the equipment is ready. Green light for Operation Lakefront. Margaret Blackwood's carefully constructed defense crumbled in real time. Those messages don't mean what you think they mean. But Stevens wasn't finished. She produced audio recordings that the FBI had recovered from Blackwood's office computer. Ms. Blackwood, do you recognize your voice in this recording from a board meeting 6 months ago? The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Blackwood's voice filled the room. David Chen thinks he can hide behind his grandfather's legacy. But we're going to show him what happens when you cross the Willowbrook community. If we can't buy him out or scare him out, we'll find another way to get him out. The jury looked horrified. Several jurors were taking extensive notes. Thomas Crane's lawyer immediately requested a sidebar, and David watched as the defense table descended into chaos. Jake Morrison was visibly panicking, and the other defendants were arguing with their attorneys. When court reconvened, the judge made a stunning announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that defendant Thomas Crane wishes to change his plea and cooperate with the prosecution. Margaret Blackwood's face went ashen. The courtroom was electric with tension as Thomas Crane, former police detective and HOA board member, took the witness stand as a cooperating government witness. His decision to flip had sent shockwaves through the defense team, and Margaret Blackwood sat rigid as stone, realizing her carefully constructed walls were about to come crashing down. Prosecutor Stevens approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. Mr. Crane, please tell the jury about Operation Lakefront. Crane's voice was barely above a whisper. It was Margaret's idea from the beginning. She wanted to systematically remove property owners who didn't fit her vision for the lake community. The Chen property was just the first target. How many properties were targeted? 12. We had a 5-year plan to acquire them all, either through forced sales or by manufacturing legal problems for the owners. David felt sick. His family's nightmare had been part of a much larger conspiracy. Stevens continued her questioning. Tell the jury about the fake police raid. Crane took a shaky breath. Margaret hired Guardian Elite specifically because Jake Morrison could obtain authentic-looking law enforcement equipment. We created fake warrants, fake badges, everything needed to make it look official, and the drug planting. That was the backup plan. If we couldn't scare people off their property, we'd frame them for serious crimes, make them too expensive to defend. The jury looked appalled. One elderly woman was shaking her head in disgust. But Stevens wasn't done. Mr. Crane, you mentioned 12 properties. Were there other victims the jury hasn't heard about? Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez was threatened with deportation using fake ICE agents. The Murphy family's teenage son was falsely accused of selling drugs at school. The Jeffersons had their water contaminated with industrial chemicals to force health department violations. David's hands clenched. These people weren't just greedy, they were monsters. Defense attorney Hawthorne tried to salvage Margaret Blackwood's case during his cross-examination. Mr. Crane, isn't it true that you're testifying against my client to reduce your own sentence? Yes, but everything I've said is true. You were a police officer for 20 years. Didn't you know these actions were illegal? Crane's composure finally cracked. Of course I knew. But Margaret promised me $1 million payout when all the properties were acquired. I let greed cloud my judgment. So you committed these crimes for money. We all did. Margaret showed us the development plans. Once she controlled all 12 properties, the land would be worth $50 million for luxury resort development. A gasp went through the courtroom. This wasn't just about HOA harassment, it was about a massive real estate conspiracy. Judge Martinez called for a brief recess, and David watched as Margaret Blackwood huddled with her lawyers, their expressions growing increasingly desperate. When court reconvened, the prosecution rested their case. The defense, clearly rattled by Crane's testimony, offered only brief character witnesses before resting as well. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Stevens delivered a passionate summation. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed is not just a crime, it's an assault on the very foundation of property rights in America. The defendants didn't just terrorize the Chen family. They threatened the security that every American feels in their own home. Defense attorney Hawthorne made a last-ditch effort to save his client. Margaret Blackwood may have shown poor judgment, but she never intended for anyone to be hurt. She's guilty of trusting the wrong people, not orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. We, the jury, find the defendant Margaret Blackwood guilty on all counts. David felt Sarah squeeze his hand as the verdicts were read. Guilty on conspiracy charges. Guilty on civil rights violations. Guilty on fraud. Guilty on impersonating federal officers. Jake Morrison, guilty on all counts. The remaining defendants, guilty on all counts. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. But the courtroom drama wasn't overdone as the defendants were led away in handcuffs. FBI agent Kim approached David with a grim expression. "Mr. Chen, we need to talk. We've discovered something during our investigation that changes everything." In a private conference room, Agent Kim spread out a new set of documents. "We found these in Margaret Blackwood's home safe during our search warrant execution." David stared at architectural plans and environmental impact studies for a massive resort development called La Serenity Paradise. The proposed site encompassed not just the 12 targeted properties, but the entire lake watershed. "We also found this," Agent Kim said, producing a contract with a major international hotel chain. Blackwood had already negotiated a $200 million development deal, contingent on acquiring the necessary properties. Patricia Morse whistled low. This was never about HOA standards. This was about stealing people's land for a massive commercial development. But Agent Kim wasn't finished. "There's more. We've traced the money trail, and Margaret Blackwood wasn't the mastermind. She was working for someone else." David's blood ran cold. "Who?" "The Lake Serenity Trust, a shell company owned by Agent Kim." Paused dramatically. "Congressman Bradley Ashford, whose family owns the hotel chain that was going to develop the resort." The room fell silent. A sitting member of Congress had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. Blackwood was just the front person, Agent Kim continued. Ashford couldn't be directly connected to the property acquisition scheme, so he used his old law school roommate Margaret to do the dirty work. David felt a mixture of vindication and renewed anger. So what happens now? Now we go after the real mastermind. 6 months later, sentencing hearing was standing room only. Margaret Blackwood received 12 years in federal prison. Thomas Crane got 8 years for cooperation. Jake Morrison got 15 years as the operational leader of the fake police raids. But the biggest victory came when Congressman Bradley Ashford was arrested on federal racketeering charges. His political career was over, and his hotel development empire was collapsing under FBI scrutiny. David stood outside the courthouse with his family, finally able to breathe freely for the first time in over a year. Emma, now 9, tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, are the bad people really going to jail?" David knelt down to her level. "Yes, sweetheart, they're going to jail for a very long time, and we can keep Grandpa's cabin forever and always." As the family drove back toward Lake Serenity, David reflected on the journey from harassment victim to the person who had exposed one of the largest property fraud conspiracies in state history. His grandfather's modest cabin had become the catalyst for bringing down a criminal empire, but the story had one final twist. 3 weeks later, David received a call from Patricia Morse. "David, you need to see the news." On his laptop screen, David watched a breaking news report. Federal investigators today announced the discovery of similar property acquisition schemes in 12 other states, all connected to the Lake Serenity conspiracy. The FBI estimates that over 400 families may have been targeted by what they're calling the largest property fraud network in U.S. history. David Chen, the software engineer who just wanted to preserve his family's cabin, had inadvertently exposed a nationwide criminal conspiracy that had been stealing homes from families across America. As he sat on his grandfather's porch, watching the sunset paint Lake Serenity in shades of gold and crimson, David realized that sometimes the greatest victories come from simply refusing to back down. When you know you're right, the lake was peaceful again, but more importantly, it was home. And the story was inspired by true events of HOA overreach and property rights violations, though names and specific details have been fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The tactics described fake police raids, evidence planting, and coordinated harassment represent real documented cases of criminal HOA behavior across the United States. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of, or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA confessional stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.